Hi everyone, I am Leah Goodwin, and this is my message to you on Proverbs 31, the woman who fears the Lord. This is a really special scripture that I've studied for many years and just really enjoy this, and I think that a lot of women can get a lot from this. So, I know that I've gone through life constantly thinking that I'm not good enough or that I'm not doing enough. I've spent countless sleepless nights wondering if I'm living up to the plans that God has for me. Proverbs 31 talks about this noble woman, which is something that I have inspired to be my entire life. But I'm in this state sometimes where I question if I'm good enough or if I'm pretty enough. So then that makes me wonder if I'm even living up to the standards of this Proverbs 31 noble woman. The woman who fears the Lord, but at the same time is wise and takes care of her family and her household. And I know that I'm not the only woman who has gone through life wondering if we're good enough or if we're doing enough. I know that there are women out there in the world who have spent countless sleepless nights, not just because they may be mothers, but because they're constantly worrying about their future. We live in a society where women are constantly being put under scrutiny. We are compared constantly to one another based on the value of our beauty. Young girls all around the world, including ourselves, at one point or another, have been told what we should look like or how we should act. From the models on Instagram to the actresses and pop stars we see on our TV screens to the magazine covers we see at the checkout lanes at the supermarket. We are constantly being influenced by what we should look like instead of what Scripture tells us a woman should be and look like. For those of you who are not familiar with Proverbs 31, the noble woman, I'm going to read it to you. So Proverbs 31, chapter 10 is where we're going to be starting off at. So, an excellent wife who can find. She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maids. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard and dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hand to the distaff and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hands to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchants. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the times to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teachings of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the way of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gate. So throughout this section of text, we are constantly reminded who we are through God, but also how we should act and look. Scripture tells us that we are far more precious than jewels, so we need to be holding ourselves to those standards. Instead of constantly tearing ourselves down because we deem ourselves not pretty enough, we need to remember that we are more precious than jewels. When we spend hours looking in the mirror, criticizing every inch of our body based on the way that we look or the way that our clothes fit, we need to remember that God is telling us how we should dress, metaphorically. That we need to dress ourselves with the garments of strength and put on clothing of dignity. When we feel we aren't doing enough, we need to remember what Scripture tells us and what God tells us. That when we are feeling we aren't doing enough, We need to remember that we need to be willing to work with our hands and have hands that are open to the poor and reach out and extend our hands to the needy. When we have those sleepless nights, we need to remember that scripture, and God tells us that our lamp never goes out at night. When we are confused on what we should say or do, we need to remember that we need to have a mouth that speaks wisdom and a tongue that teaches kindness. When we are constantly worrying and anxious about the future and the hardship that happens to our families and homes, we need to remember that we, a noble woman of God, a God-fearing woman, that we are not afraid because we are the strength of our household and we ready our homes for the winter seasons. And for those women out there who are constantly worrying if they are good enough, whether that's being a mom, a wife, a sister, a daughter, we need to remember that our children will rise up and call us blessed, and that our husbands will say the same about us and say that we surpass all other women. But most importantly, when we look in the mirror and we start to tear ourselves down because we are comparing ourselves to that supermodel that we just saw on our Instagram feed, or the supermodel that we saw on the cover of a magazine at the checkout lane, we need to remember what God says about us. That we are, one, far more precious than jewels, and two, that charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord should be praised. So the next time that you are wondering if you are good enough or if you're pretty enough, remember what God says about a noble woman. Stop tearing yourself down and comparing yourself to another woman. For God never compares you and I to another woman, but rather he describes what we should do and look like. Proverbs 31 tells us that we are far more precious than jewels, that one jewel cannot be compared to another, because we are all beautifully made. We need to be living our lives as this noble woman mentioned in Proverbs 31. We need to hold ourselves to the same standards that God does, instead of tearing ourselves down because we may not meet the beauty standards that our society has put in place. We need to act like this noble woman of Proverbs 31. So today and every day, look in the mirror and just remember and remind yourself of what Scripture tells us who we are through God, because we are far more precious than jewels.